Welcome to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dairy Herd Health Troubleshooting Podcast, a podcast series focused on how to go about looking into health issues on a dairy. Each episode will discuss a different area on the dairy where herd health can be impacted. This series has less to do with providing answers to problems. We'll be talking about how to be more successful in your investigations.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about troubleshooting reproductive problems on your farm. I'm Kathy Barrett with Cornell's PRO-DAIRY program, and with us to discuss this topic is my colleague, Dr. Rob Lynch, who is our herd health management specialist with the Cornell PRO-DAIRY program, and veterinarian. Welcome, Rob.
Hey, Kathy. Glad to be here.
Rob, I thought we would kind of just walk through some of the things that you feel are important for looking at a reproductive program.
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants to know how well the repro program is doing. I think it's pretty well understood in the industry that reproductive efficiency improves the farm's lifetime production, lifetime profitability, if done correctly. What we end up doing with an efficient milking herd breeding program is we just increase the lifetime production of those animals. And then we also increase our replacement numbers. So it gives us more options in the milking herd to make culling decisions to remove the less profitable animals from the herd. And probably it's the replacement benefit of a good repro program that's probably more valuable to the dairy than moving those animals to a lower days in milk average.
So with a farm, where would they start? When you're talking to them, do you ask them about what it is they're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, we need to know kind of where things are now. And that usually starts with a discussion with who's on the team as far as it comes to the breeding program. It's the herd owner, the herd managers, the employees that are doing the breeding, doing the heat detection, the veterinarian, everyone who's involved in running the breeding program. Are we all on the same page? What are the goals? What are we trying to accomplish with our breeding program? And then we also want to take a look at the data to see where do things exist right now. And you can't even start analyzing the data until you get a good understanding that the data is, it reflects what's actually happening on the farm, that's entered correctly and consistently by everyone who's doing that task.
Once you've got that accomplished, where do you go from there, Rob?
Well, I like to break the breeding program down into some basic elements. And we try to avoid the flawed dairy metrics, things like calving interval and average days open, and really focus on things like pregnancy rate, conception risk, heat detection rate. That's our way to break this repro program down. And I see the breeding program in 6 basic pieces. The first piece being the voluntary wait period. Has the farm established a period of time where we allow cows to not get bred until we feel like they're ready? And so we establish a firm voluntary wait period, and inseminations just don't happen until animals have passed that days in milk. And then we start looking at the first service breeding program, and that can be broken into 2 pieces. First service that happened because of observed estrus, and first service that happens because of timed AI. And farms may do a lot of one or very little of one. And so we look at both of those pieces separately. And then we'd like to know if farm is really, their goal is to breed a lot of cows on estrus behavior for first service. Well, it's good to know what proportion of the breedings are happening that way. If their goal is to do a lot of that, and we look at the records and there's only 25% of cows bred on observed estrus for first service, well, they're not meeting their goals. And then we've got all breedings that happened after first service. And so we look at second and subsequent service due to estrus detection efforts, and second and subsequent service due to timed AI resynchronization efforts. And really understanding the goals of the farm as far as how they prefer to run their breeding program. Does this farm, do they really want to breed most of their cows off of observed estrus, or do they want to rely more heavily on a systemized timed AI program? And kind of knowing where their interests lie will help us decide, like, is there an improvement in the breeding program that can be made that fits with what their stated goals are? If you got a dairy that really just doesn't want to give shots, they don't want to do a lot of timed AI, we certainly don't want to entertain a complicated fixed time AI synchronization program that has multiple steps and something they weren't interested in. So you'd have to have a pretty compelling reason to ask them to do that. Part of that second service is identifying open cows. So the longer we go until we get an animal re-inseminated after we've figured out she was open, like that's time counted against her from a repro efficiency standpoint. So are we finding cows open and getting them re-inseminated efficiently? That's a pretty important part of the breeding program.
So what other kind of things do you see that are a roadblock for producers really getting to the issue that's limiting their program?
Yeah, I mean, there's some common problems that I've seen just over the years looking at repro records. One would be an over-analysis of the data, where we basically start splitting the numbers down so small that we're trying to make comparisons on very small sample sizes. And smaller the sample size, the more likely that any difference we're seeing is just random chance. We have to be careful that we don't split these numbers down so small that we're really not looking at meaningful differences. And I'll give credit to Paul Fricke at one of his presentations years ago, mentioned something in the realm of like 400 to 500 breeding events per group to make any meaningful comparison on differences in fertility to those two different programs. And so when we're on a dairy and we're splitting it down to let's look at just first lactation animals and let's look at just first lactation animals that had this breeding code, all of a sudden we're looking at very small numbers, and it's not meaningful. So break them down to steps where management can really make a difference. Let's look at all first service timed AIs, not 8 different first service timed AI codes. And so because we're not really going to make a management change based on all those different subtle tweaks to the first service program.
Are there some metrics that you suggest people start with when they're looking at their data?
Yeah, I think pregnancy risk and pregnancy rate, that's become kind of the standard, an overall breeding efficiency. And it's been pretty well established now in dairy reproduction, but it's of all the animals who were eligible to get pregnant over a set period of time, what proportion of those actually did. And so it builds in a heat detection efficiency element to that, and it also builds in fertility in that number. And so we break that down in 21-day intervals. That's the general length of a cow estrus cycle. And so every 21 days, we've got each cow that's past the voluntary wait period is eligible for a breeding. And then the question lies, did she get inseminated? Was she seen in estrus, or did she get enrolled in a timed AI? And if she did get inseminated, was it fertile? Did she actually conceive to that breeding?
And those are like pretty straightforward, basic types of practices, things to look at. Do you find that that's often the case, that you need to look at the basics first?
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to assume that if there's an issue on the farm, it's something rare and interesting, and it may be, but we start with the basics. And I think a common thing I've seen over the years is there's a lot of assumptions made, and investigations leave out certain pieces, and they just assume it's fine. Basics like semen tanks with no nitrogen, semen handling, getting these straws out of the tank in a way that doesn't do a lot of damage, following the thaw recommendations from the semen company, making sure the equipment that's doing this is actually calibrated, making sure that insemination is happening in a timely manner after the semen's thawed, and basic insemination technique. It's just people doing these tasks, and sometimes people develop bad habits or never really had a good habit to begin with. And so we don't want to leave out the basic pieces of what leads to a fertile breeding when we're trying to investigate a breeding problem.
So along those lines, how about looking at the data and coming up with a false conclusion about what's going on?
Yeah, it's pretty classic where we want to assume that the difference in these numbers are because of X when it may not have anything to do with it. And I think the classic example of that is assigning blame for poor fertility to a certain technician. But when you kind of look more thoroughly at which animals that technician is presented for breeding, it's just a different set of animals compared to the other technicians on the dairy. So we just want to be, eyes wide open when we're trying to make these evaluations and we're making an apples and apples comparison. The other issue we run into is animals set up for failure before they even get to the breeding program. You can't forget that every animal coming into the breeding program has just gone through her transition. And so negative energy balance, metabolic disease, metritis issues through the cow's fresh period, she's coming into the breeding group maybe with the cards stacked against her. And so we got to make sure that we have fertile cows coming into the breeding program. And if we do, kind of any of the breeding programs that the farm chooses to use will work better just because they've got a more fertile group to work with.
Okay. Anything else, Rob, that you think we should touch on?
I guess I like to look at a lot of things on the dairy from a HACCP approach and try to figure out, are there critical control points earlier on in the process that we could be monitoring and head off issues on a dairy before it's really costly. And so, waiting for fertility to drop or preg rate to drop, we've lost a lot of ground there. So maybe we could put in place semen handling, monitoring, insemination technique reviews and trainings and heat abatement strategies and things that we know will improve fertility. Can we be evaluating those steps on a regular basis so we can avoid the down the road effects of when repro does go down? And I also think this is a team approach. And so, I think if the repro team has gotten together and agreed on a plan and their goals are, and those goals are realistic, and we kind of set some timelines of when we'd like to achieve these goals by, and let's set some plans in place. So what do we do if we aren't reaching our goals by our stated timelines? What kind of steps are we going to agree that we're going to take to address this issue if it doesn't get better? And when we do reach those goals, that there's some success celebrated with everybody.
Thanks very much, Rob. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, everyone loves looking at their repro program and they want to know that it works and they want to make smart decisions on ways to enhance it. And so I guess I'll put in a plug for some of the economic tools that are available out there. Dr. Giordano, when he was at Wisconsin, developed a really nice, robust financial tool. I think now is housed on the Wisconsin's dairy extension website for comparing one repro program to another. And it lets the farm plug in all of their own inputs and make an economic decision based on, does it make sense for the farm to invest in a new strategy for breeding cows a certain way, or what results they're getting now compared to what results they expect to get with the new program. And when we make management changes like that, we really want to make sure they're well based in economics.
Absolutely. So thanks again, Rob. And folks, tune in for the rest of our series on troubleshooting herd health issues on your dairy.
Thanks for listening to this herd health troubleshooting episode. You can find more episodes like this one on the CCE Dairy Educator channel on SoundCloud or on the PRO-DAIRY website, along with many other resources.